Today we've got a very special guest, Manny Amadi. Manny sits on our Red Badgers Advisory Board and advises us on anything purpose related. Manny was named a responsible business guru by the Guardian newspaper and is a trusted advisor to some of the world's foremost companies, non-governmental organisations, trusts and foundations, and high-impact philanthropists. Manny has worked in advisory capacity on a wide range of issues with leading multinational companies, international agencies and NGOs. He advises various local, national and international NGOs in a voluntary capacity and has a particular commitment to working to advance the interests of young people around the world. Amongst other honours, Manny was made a member of the Royal Victorian Order by the Queen in recognition of his work on behalf of young people. It's a real pleasure to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Cain. It's great to be here, and it's lovely to be called a special guest.
I hope that was a fitting introduction.
Thank you. I shall try not to blush.
Yeah. So I'm just going to get straight into some of the questions. How do you define a purpose-led business, and how have they evolved to be more purpose-led?
Well, purpose really is about a company's fundamental reason for being. So, it's about actually how a company behaves and how it goes about delivering its services day to day. And a purpose-led company would put society and societal consideration at the heart of its strategy and its business practices. So across its value chain, how it sources, markets, distributes, produces goods and services, and engages with stakeholders and so on. So it seeks to create shareholder value by serving society rather than exclusively focusing on just creating shareholder value. That would be how I would define it. And in terms of how that agenda towards purpose has evolved, I mean, we can go into we can kind of go 2 centuries back up to the kind of 19th century and so on, or we can start in the present. So in days gone by, some, possibly many business leaders actually were very enlightened and progressive in terms of their approach to doing business. They put society at the heart of businesses. So if you think about the Cadburys, for instance, Jesse Boots, for instance, who gave birth to the company Boots that we know today, and so on, they really thought about not just thought about the mission, if you like, of their company. So serving society, keeping people well, etc., but also treating their employees and the communities as well as they can, and engaging with society and so on and so on. So, but of course, in the late 20th century, there was a movement away from that and a greater emphasis on shareholder capitalism, which seemed to be more short-term oriented and focused more just on shareholders, to the exclusion really of all other stakeholders. So if a company externalized its costs, for instance, and created problems for society, polluted and had sweatshops and so on in the process of allegedly creating shareholder value, that was all that seemed to matter. Now, not all companies were like that, but that was dominant logic. So short-termism, focus on shareholder and so on. And in the last 20 years or so, I'm pleased to say there has been an evolution towards now purpose. And that journey has been, so for business leaders and companies, it's evolved fairly slowly. So from a focus perhaps on philanthropy, if you like, so companies thinking about making the odd donation and gifts to good causes and therefore deeming themselves as good companies. That has evolved towards through sort of community investment, so the emphasis on investment implying some kind of expected return for the company, through to CSR, corporate social responsibility, and then to more recently sustainability, responsible business, shared value, and so on. And all of those things are important, but purpose really sits at the heart of a company. It's about actually whole system change, the company thinking about its role in society. And when you have that right, it motivates, inspires employees, galvanizes action on the behalf of stakeholders, consumers, and so on. And so that's how I would. So essentially, to conclude, I think the fundamental reason for being that really excites people internally and connects with stakeholders outside, and also creates value for all stakeholders, including shareholders.
Great, thanks, Manny. It's refreshing to hear that over the last 20 years, that is where companies are starting to evolve into being more purpose-led. Which leads me on to my next question. Obviously, you've just described previous thought was, the main focus was all about shareholder value. Does it make business sense to be purpose-led, in your view?
I would say unequivocally yes. Now, of course, it's a bit like buying a piece of art, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I guess, an expression. And so sometimes it's a combination of the head and the heart. And so with purpose, sometimes you're talking about intangible value. So in the way that, again, 20, 30 years ago, accountancy was all about tangible value and assets and so on. And over the last 30 years or so, there's been an evolution into the recognition of intangible value. So brands, for instance, and reputation and perception and connectedness and so on, all of those things matter more now. I think similarly, the business case for purpose and purpose-led growth has those two elements, the tangible and the intangible. And the proof of value, I think, is actually becoming more and more explicit. So, to give you an example, Unilever, which is a highly respected company, deemed to be, they've worked very hard. Sort of 10 years ago, they started on a journey focused around what they call the Sustainable Living Plan. And that involved wholesale change for the organization, but it's been quite a journey for them. They discovered, I think, last year, that I believe, if I can get the numbers right, something like 70% of company profitability came from the brands in their portfolio that were purpose-led. So they had a core mission or purpose, which would be around perhaps enabling people to wash their hands and promoting good hygiene, etc. So those brands accounted for 70% of company profitability and something like nearly 50% of company growth. So that's sort of a micro single organization example. To give you a macro example, just this week, in fact, BlackRock, so the world's largest asset management company, released a piece of research just showing that, the headlines, I think, were that ESG, so environmental, social, and governance tilted investment portfolios have outperformed their counterparts during this coronavirus pandemic. So in the last 3 months, I think one of the kind of funds found that 51 out of 57 of their sustainable indices outperformed their counterparts. So, really strong evidence that doing things like looking after your employees, connecting more deeply with the consumers, engaging with stakeholders, and so on, to meet everyone's interests, creates sustainable value over time. And the thing about purpose is it looks to the short term and long term. So it looks at actually how an organization creates value across its entire value chain, and it balances the short term and the long term, and that's quite an important thing. And so Larry Fink, for instance, the CEO of BlackRock, had a kind of quite a great phrase, which is that essentially, I'm going to have to bastardize this phrase, value and shareholder value and purpose are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the two things are very strongly interlinked.
Great. I hope more business leaders start to think that way as well. The evidence shows that just being shareholder value driven is actually not the best approach for business and profit.
Well, I mean, that's a mindset. I mean, I'm pleased to say that businesses have been on a journey over recent years, and many more business leaders are getting it, so to speak. But it's of course not sufficient to get it. It's also about actually then embarking on actions to embed and sustain and so on.
Yes, great. So what can businesses do? Because I think obviously sometimes this is companies that are not purpose led are due to, in my view, they're due to kind of people not caring about it, but also some do care about it, but they just don't understand how to execute it. And so what can businesses do to ensure that purpose is understood and lived throughout their organization and kind of filters throughout everything and every level and everything that they do?
First of all, take it seriously, I think, and sometimes these things can be a leap of faith, right? So you don't have entirely the proof of concept, and as a leader, you have to find your own path. That's essentially one of the things that leadership is about, and having the courage to, I think, to make decisions without having every single piece of answer. But the starting point is about actually definition. So back to the core. What is the greatest value that my company can add to the world around it? How can we make a difference to our consumers and to society and so on by leveraging our competencies, our assets, and so on? And so building your value proposition around that is quite an important thing. And in that process of definition, it's important that a leader engages the whole organization and indeed stakeholders outside the organization. So the voices of employees, not just management team and the board and non-executives and so on, is important in this. And also the point of view of consumers and the point of view of other stakeholders. That's quite an important start. Also thinking about materiality. So what are the issues that are most relevant to the company that it can help solve? Because of course, if a company decided it wanted to do something that wasn't really close to its core, then its attempts to solve that problem may not sustain over time. So materiality, I think, is important, and so on. And then I think so relating things to the company's value proposition, I think, is essential. Setting clear goals coming out of that is then also quite an important next step beyond that, and often ambitious goals that can galvanize people to do things, to wake up in the morning excited about going to work, and doing those things, engage employees, inspire them, it drives retention, and so on, as well as of course adding value to customers and so on. So those are important steps. And then beyond that, I think communicating goals as effectively as possible internally and externally, and then locking in the commitments that you make to the business processes and systems. That's really important. And so I kind of talk about hardware and software. So hardware would be, objectives, commitments, goals, processes, systems, and so on. But the software bits are also really very important. So the reward systems, the relationships, and so on. Those are quite important things. So locking. It's a bit like kind of a leadership team that has a balanced scorecard methodology for driving business performance and results and so on. So this is really quite similar. So ensuring that this is locked into results for leaders as well as others in business, in terms of incentives, but also sanctions. So when people are not living to the purpose of the company, making sure they're called out and held to account, that's important, and so on. So those would be quite important steps for leaders to take to really deeply embed purpose into their culture, into their way of being, and that then would drive sustainable purpose, so that when a leader moves on from an organization, for instance, this is not sort of something that they just say, this is not just a single person's passion point, but it's actually embedded and locked in to an organization. So those would be the steps, I think. And then finally, I'd say accountability is quite important. So therefore, having not just clear goals, but actually then reporting to stakeholders, to employees, to shareholders, to the wider stakeholder groups and so on how they are performing, whether it's on diversity and inclusion, on the modern slavery goals, on the impact of their products and services, and so on. So all of those are quite important things. So quite a few things to do, but you can see there's perhaps a journey and the process around all of that.
Great. And just relating to that same question, in your experience, what is the catalyst for starting to put those things into motion? Is it normally a change of leadership, or is it kind of an existing leadership team kind of changing strategy and, sort of hiring the help of someone like yourself to take them along on that journey?
The latter's great when that happens. Sometimes it's yes, a point of change, so a new leader perhaps, and sometimes it's an organization there's been a particular trigger, so a burning platform. Sometimes it's actually a competitor doing something, and therefore impacting a particular company that wants to not only keep up but actually move ahead. I'd say the triggers for engaging in purpose-led agenda break into probably three key levers. They're not mutually exclusive, but for the purpose of this conversation, I'll kind of frame them as such. There's either risk, opportunity, or values. So risk as in identifying and mitigating risk, and that might be reputational risk, operational risk, legal risks, etc. And being a purpose-led company that takes a responsible business or sustainability really seriously allows companies to really understand the world around them and to see things coming down the line and to have inclusive voices and so on in decision making and so on, and therefore companies are likely to be more resilient, which in fact is what the BlackRock report is demonstrating. The opportunity piece is about actually identifying that by engaging with consumers and stakeholders in a way that is purpose-led and so on, and meets consumers where they are and where their interests are, or indeed meets employees where their interests are, so employees can bring their whole self to work and so on, you are then creating value. You are in a growing opportunity. And in that regard, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that are set up by the UN, so what I refer to as the world's to-do list, is really important. It has shown that by helping to tackle some of the world's greatest challenges, companies can create value. So there are trillions of dollars, pounds worth of value to be attained in companies seeking to address issues, whether that is education and health and various other, and the environment and various other areas. And then the third platform, so to speak, lever, is to do with value. So some companies, perhaps John Lewis, might just decide this is who we are. Right, this is our culture, this is what we do, this is our approach to doing business and so on. And the other two reasons are perhaps important, but that kind of at the core are their values. As I say, they're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes it's all of those three things, and sometimes something might trigger that to then trigger kind of the immediate action.
Great, thank you. So, given that we're currently in very strange times in the midst of pandemic that hasn't been seen for over 100 years, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 on companies like driving towards a purpose-led business approach in the future?
This comes with a bit of health warning. I'm partial to this agenda, and so we can't guarantee things. But I think everything we see is telling us that actually the trends that were happening before, so that movement I mentioned towards purpose-led growth, the fact that companies that are purpose-led and takes the sustainability agenda and the responsible business agenda very seriously are outperforming their counterparts and so on. So all of those things tell us, I think, that actually the COVID-19 pandemic actually will supercharge the purpose in companies. I'm pretty confident that's what will happen going forward. Now, COVID-19 and the pandemic, I think, has been, in my view, a sort of a moment of truth for businesses that before the pandemic defined themselves as as purpose-led, and of course the risk of that is the skeptics, the cynics talk about the risk of woke washing, so companies clothing themselves in purpose, so to speak, when actually that's not what they are, or who they are, or what they do, and when they don't really believe or walk the talk. And so we saw at the beginning of this, some companies actually fail really badly. So companies perhaps, defining themselves as essential workers, providing essential services when actually they didn't at all, and therefore putting their employees in the invidious position of having to decide whether or not to go to work or keep themselves safe. On the other hand, you see other companies really ramping up and standing up and doing amazing things in response to COVID. Now, so I think post COVID-19, I think the move towards purpose-led growth will accelerate.
Fantastic. That gives me hope. I'm hoping you're right.
It gives all of us hope.
So just to wrap up, one final question. What should, in your view, be the current focus of purpose-led business leaders, and how can they sort of help make change happen and contribute to the UN SDGs that you mentioned?
Well, there are a number of things that it's an exciting time, but it's also a really busy time. So company leaders are, really still focusing on business continuity as they must, and looking after their employees as they must, and etc. But on the other hand, I think it's also a time to reimagine the future. It's a really important time to reimagine the future. So and to build back better. So that we make sure that the world that comes after COVID-19 is a much better one. It's a more inclusive one, for instance, than was the case before. So in the same way as the Second World War, post the Second World War, there was a settlement, which in the UK was about building a land fit for heroes, and more globally was about building systems, the UN and various others and so on, that from which we all benefited for several years and so on. I think there is an opportunity here for business leaders to play a role in their own organizations and outside. So the things to do would include, I think, revisiting, if appropriate, the purpose of companies and reimagining where necessary. So I talked about the value propositions that companies have previously. So how relevant will that be for the world post-COVID? Do they need to do more, or tighten or focus more? So non-profit organizations, for instance, NGOs, international agencies are looking at their theories of change and sometimes changing their business models. And I think that there's the same challenge or opportunity, I think, faces business leaders. So that's one thing. And then I think exploring how they can create even better value for their employees, for society at large, and so on, I think is a second related opportunity and challenge. And then thirdly, I think collaborating with others within their business sectors and outside their sectors, I think, would be quite important. And what's encouraging is, COVID has led to there's a lot of evidence of that. So even amongst competitors, actually, collaboration to make sure, for instance, we're all fed and so on. So so more collaboration, collective action, and so will be quite important. But of course, you get your house in order first, and then you reach out and improve the broader system. And finally, I think there is something about business leaders really having a voice, advocating to make sure that the world post-COVID is better than it was going forward. So to summarize all of that, there are sort of micro actions within the company, and then there are the macro actions using the influence, the convening power, and so on that business leaders have.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Manny, for your valuable insight. And it's certainly been inspiring for me and some food for thought for how I can help impact Red Badger, and I'm sure it will also be extremely valuable for others that view this discussion as well. So thank you very much for your time. That was absolutely brilliant.
Thanks for having me. Great conversation. Good to be in conversation with you. Thanks, Cain. Good to see you.
Take care, Manny. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.